Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 20 for History 101, and we're going to pick up with the election of 1808. Thomas Jefferson served his 2 terms. He's more than ready to bow out gracefully. Jefferson did not want the country to engage in war, and it was becoming closer and closer every day. So he will sort of hand select the person to take over for him, and that'll be his Secretary of State and very close friend, James Madison. So Madison will be the Democratic Republican candidate in 1808, and Charles Pinckney will be the Federalist candidate. Madison will win the election and take over as president in March of 1809. And he takes over a country where the economy's in shambles thanks to the Embargo Act, and things are moving closer and closer to a war with England because the British are antagonizing the Americans in the old Northwest Territory or the Great Lakes region, because they are doing what they had done previously before the Jay Treaty, riling up Native American allies to take a stand against American settlers. So a combination of that and the continued impressment of sailors is heightening tensions between the United States and England. Now, things are really going to heat up out in present-day Indiana, because a Native American that I had mentioned earlier in lectures, who was at the Battle of Fallen Timbers and saw the debacle at Fort Miami, but was smart enough not to go to the fort, is the great Shawnee warrior Tecumseh. Tecumseh now in 1810, 1811 had started a movement among Native Americans to resist white encroachment upon their lands in the old Northwest Territory. And he and his brother, who emerged as a prophet among Indian people, started the Pan-Indian movement. And they are going to get tribes from all over the West. And this is in your book on page 227, the Tecumseh and the Prophet is the name of the subheading. They will get native tribes to join into this alliance because more and more white Americans are moving out into the old Northwest Territory and encroaching on Indian lands. The negotiations begin between the United States and Tecumseh representing the Pan-Indians, and they're going to center in the state of Indiana where Shawnee lands are, between Tecumseh and the territorial governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison. Now, many of you know later on in his career, in 1840, he'll go on to be president of the United States. This is when he's the territorial governor of Indiana. These negotiations between Harrison and Tecumseh will fall apart in 1811, and ultimately it will lead to conflict because the Pan-Indians will seek alliances with the British, and the British will start arming them. There'll be a battle that happens after the United States government gives Harrison permission to attack the home village of Tecumseh and his brother, who becomes known as the Prophet. That's the village of Tippecanoe. It's the Shawnee village on Tippecanoe Creek. Now, Harrison and territorial militia will attack the village. They didn't know that Tecumseh and most of the warriors were not there. They were traveling around the West recruiting more tribes to become members, and they'll wipe out a lot of women and children. Now, when Tecumseh returns from his ventures to unite the Pan-Indian movement, even recruiting tribes down in the South like the Creek and Chickasaw, he will be furious to discover that his family has been killed at the hands of William Henry Harrison and the Indiana militia. This will ultimately lead to all-out warfare between the Pan-Indian movement and Western forces of the United States. Now, I've put some links in there about Tecumseh and the Prophet. If you're interested in reading more about them, they're pretty amazing guys, and there's a lot of sort of mystical things associated with them that I don't have time to talk to you about today. But in December of 1811, basically all-out war begins between these two warring parties, the Pan-Indian movement and Western militia forces. So in reality, since the Indians are backed by the British, the War of 1812 sort of begins in December of 1811. And because of this conflict going on out west, it's going to lead us closer and closer to all-out war with England. And by the time we get to June of 1812, James Madison will have no choice, even though he's reluctant about it, but to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. Congress will debate this heavily, and it will not be unanimous by any stretch of the imagination, and America will reluctantly go into war with England, which is known as the War of 1812. Now, if you look in your book, now we're into chapter 11, there's a map showing us conflict during the War of 1812 on page 233. Now, this war in the beginning, for the most part, is going to happen out west. And you can see there are battles in August of 1812 between American forces and the British in the Detroit area at Fort Detroit. There's also going to be battles in far northern Michigan up on Mackinac Island. And then in 1813, conflicts will begin and the Americans will start to turn things around because initially, being unprepared for war, the British are taking it to the Americans with their Indian allies in the West, namely Tecumseh and the Pan-Indian movement. But then Harrison in 1813 will have his big victory at Fort Meigs in Ohio, and the really big victory will be in September on Lake Erie when Admiral Perry will defeat the British Navy at the Battle of Put-in Bay on Lake Erie in September. That will be followed in October of 1813 at the Battle of the Thames River in southwestern Ontario. The importance of that battle will be that the great Shawnee warrior and leader of the Pan-Indian movement, Tecumseh, will die on the battlefield. When Tecumseh dies, slowly but surely the Pan-Indian movement will unravel and the British will lose a significant group of allies because of this. Now, something else that's going to happen in 1813 is those same frontier forces, mainly made up of militia groups from Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, led by William Henry Harrison, and also by Commander Zebulon Pike, who also was an adventurer out west like Lewis and Clark, will attack the British capital of Canada in Upper Canada, and the name of that city at this point in history is York. York will later on turn into what is today Toronto. And if you've ever been to Toronto, there's still an old section of Toronto known as Yorktown, which was the original British capital of Canada. Remember, they had a British capital in Upper Canada. This is York. The more French capital was in Quebec City, in present-day Quebec, which was known as Lower Canada back then. So, we attack York, we conquer it, the British surrender York to the Americans, but these are some ragtag militiamen. They're going to get carried away after their great victory. They're going to go rummaging through warehouses of the British in their capital, and they're going to uncover a large sum of rum, barrel after barrel. They'll break into this rum, celebrating their great victory over the British, and really a victorious year for the Americans out west. And in the process, they'll burn the city of York to the ground for no reason whatsoever. The British had already surrendered. So the Americans burned the British capital of Canada for no reason. Also, unfortunately, during this event, while they're burning the city, the British Powder Magazine, which is a heavily enforced concrete, or not stone building back then, where they'd keep all their gunpowder, caught on fire, ignited, and exploded. One large piece of stone from the powder magazine, unfortunately, landed right on top of General Zebulon Pike's head and killed him in this horrible event. So not only do they burn York, they kill their own general accidentally, the famous Zebulon Pike. Now, the next year, 1814, the war really changes in nature because the British finally finish off Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars and are victorious. So a large contingency of very seasoned British troops can be transferred from the battlefields of Europe to the American theater of war, where this sideshow war, as far as the British were concerned, until Napoleon was finished off, the War of 1812 is happening here in North America. And the British come up with a strategy they think that will ultimately defeat the Americans. And it's sort of like digging out an old strategy from the past. They're going to have a large invasionary force come out of Canada into the Champlain Valley, very similar to General Burgoyne's invasion of 1777 that you'll remember. They're going to have another invasionary force in the Chesapeake Bay, where the game plan is this huge force of over 13,000 Brits, many of them seasoned veterans from the European Napoleonic Wars, will easily conquer the Champlain Valley, conquer Albany, the Hudson, New York City, while the Southern forces will conquer our nation's capital of Washington, D.C., and move their way north and rendezvous somewhere in the New York City area, thus splitting the country in two, and the British believe this will cause our ultimate surrender and their victory. Well, as many of you know, that's all going to fail right here in Plattsburgh in September of 1814. But before we talk about the Battle of Plattsburgh, take a look at the map and you'll notice on August 24th, 1814, there's a little red bomb going off, which signifies a British victory. And that's when British forces will burn our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Now, I can remember when I was in high school learning about the War of 1812, and basically all I learned about was the dirty, rotten Brits burned our nation's capital. How dare they? Well, let's think about this for a minute. The year before, American forces burned their capital in York for no particular reason. They had already surrendered. So the British target our capital in retaliation. In war, paybacks are hell, and we paid the price in D.C. Much of the buildings were destroyed. In fact, President Madison and his wife Dolly barely escaped Washington, riding in a wagon taking many valuable artifacts out of what becomes known as the White House and saving them from the British, with the British in hot pursuit. Now, in the meantime, up here in our neck of the woods, in late August, early September, the invasionary force comes from Canada, crossing the border up near Champlain. The British set up their northernmost headquarters in New York at Dewey's Tavern, which those of you who went to Northeastern Clinton know it's just across the street from your high school. And the British forces, 13,000 strong, will essentially march down Route 9. When they get to Chazy, they will encamp and then divide forces, and one force will go to the west and end up on what is today Route 22, marching down Route 22 while the main force continues down Route 9 towards Plattsburgh. In the meantime, there'll be skirmishes in between, including some battles at Scamotion Creek, where the Americans destroy the bridge out near, where the city beach is. And there'll also be a battle out in the Beekmantown area at Culver Hill. But ultimately, the big battle of Plattsburgh will occur on September 11th, 1814, and it'll be mainly a sea battle. The British have made it to Plattsburgh, and what's separating the two forces is the Saranac River. The Americans have built 3 fortresses on the southern side of the Saranac River, and the British are finding it a difficult time to cross the river. Their headquarters are located at what is today the Kent DeLord House, right in the city of Plattsburgh. Sporadic battles are taking place, but a British fleet comes down out of Canada. And luckily for us, the Americans have countered by building a fleet that summer in the harbor in Vergennes, Vermont, and the famous Thomas McDonough is the commander of the American fleet. He oversees the construction of it and the sea battle of Plattsburgh that takes place on September 11th, 1814. He will pull off some textbook moves using the winding movement with anchors off both the bow and the stern of the ship to be able to turn it to fire broadsides more quickly and surprise the British and defeat a superior force that day. And the British Navy will surrender to Thomas McDonough. And when the British Navy surrenders, the British land forces have no choice but to retreat back to Canada because they've lost their naval support, which they're going to need to be able to cross the Saranac and continue on south, ultimately to Albany and beyond. So in similar fashion of how we stopped the British at Saratoga in 1777, the British will be halted in Plattsburgh this time. This was a decisive victory for the Americans, and many historians argue this is what turned the tide of war and sent the British to the negotiation table, because negotiations will follow shortly after over in Ghent in the Netherlands. And by the time we get to Christmas Eve of 1814, a peace treaty has been signed. But we still have two more events to talk about as far as the war is concerned. One is a battle that takes place the day after the Battle of Plattsburgh on September 12th through 14th. The British attempt to capture Baltimore. Now, this is where the British will bombard the fortress at Baltimore in the harbor, Fort McHenry. And this is the battle that gets all the publicity from the War of 1812, because there's a very famous prisoner on board a British prison ship who watches this bombardment of Fort McHenry go on all night long. And that person is Francis Scott Key. And he's so inspired by what he sees, he ends up writing the Star-Spangled Banner, or our national anthem. Bombs bursting in air, rockets' red glare. That's all what was happening as the British attacked Fort McHenry. But when sunrise arrived, the American flag, even though torn and tattered, was still flying proudly over Fort McHenry, and it held. So, every year, tens of thousands of Americans go to Fort McHenry to celebrate the creation of the Star-Spangled Banner. And we have our celebrations up here for the Battle of Plattsburgh, but ironically enough, our battle was much more decisive. So, the war officially ends on Christmas Eve, 1814. But if you take a look at your map, another battle happens on January 8th, 1815, after the war is already over. That's the famous Battle of New Orleans, which technically speaking takes place 2 weeks after the war has ended. So the end results of the Battle of New Orleans are meaningless, except for the many thousands of men who died. Now what happens here, the British had already had plans that if their activities were successful up in the north, that they were going to try to conquer the Mississippi River. And the way you do that is the conquering of New Orleans, the port city. Now, the American forces defending New Orleans were led by somebody who will become very famous later on, General Andrew Jackson. Now, British forces will land in the New Orleans area, and Jackson's ready for them. He's going to end up luring them into a big, giant depression or gully. And once he gets the British forces down into this area, his men will appear out of nowhere, and it's like shooting fish in a barrel. He'll outsmart the British, and he'll inflict more casualties that day than the British had lost during the whole war. It's, for the British, the biggest loss they suffered. But, as I mentioned before, peace has already been reached with the Treaty of Ghent over in Netherlands, so all this was for naught. And the Battle of New Orleans, basically in modern day, with modern communications, would have never have happened. But back in this day and age, both forces fighting in New Orleans on January 8th had no idea that the Treaty of Ghent had been signed all the way over in Europe, and neither did anybody else in the United States. Because remember, it takes a couple of months for a ship to sail across the Atlantic from Europe, so we knew anything about it, and that happened on Christmas Eve. This war started with horrible communications I didn't mention earlier. When we were debating our declaration of war in June of 1812, the British Parliament had decided enough's enough, we'd had enough war, and they decided to lift the blockade on America that they had put in place, which was the deciding factor to get us to declare war. We felt like they're trying to treat us like colonists again. But the American Congress didn't know Parliament had lifted the blockade, and it's going to take a couple of months for that word to get to the British Navy. So the blockade will not be lifted until sometime into August, and by that time, we're already at war. So the war began with poor communications, which in a modern age, the war might not even started. The war ends with poor communications, with the Battle of New Orleans that happened for absolutely no reason whatsoever. So that's the War of 1812. That's as far as I'm going to get into Chapter 11 before, the quiz opens tomorrow. We'll pick back up in Chapter 11 next week, and we'll start talking about things that happen in the aftermath of war, like the Hartford Convention, which leads to the destruction of the Federalist Party once and for all, a period known as the Era of Good Feelings, and we'll be moving very quickly into the administrations of Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. So, I hope everybody does a really good job on the quiz that's going to open up tomorrow, and it's due on Sunday the 19th by midnight. And remember, you've got those ACE practice tests from chapter, I can't remember offhand, I think it's 9 through 11 or whatever. You guys know, it's on the website. So all those are due by the 19th too. So have a good weekend, work hard, and continue to be safe and stay home, and we'll get through this horrible period. So, take care. I'll talk to you next week. Bye now.